Hello and welcome to the Gaggle, where we challenge and, if necessary, destroy media narratives. I'm George Szamuely, and I just want to record a short podcast on the growing squabble between French President Emmanuel Macron and Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. We already mentioned this in an earlier podcast because, if you recall, Macron had a few days ago called for an arms embargo against Israel. It was a fairly ineffectual call on the part of Macron because France really doesn't provide much in the way of weapons to Israel, and France really doesn't have any leverage against other countries. So it was a fairly pointless, typical Macron-like gesture. And then a few days ago, when Israel shot up some UNIFIL, United Nations forces in Lebanon, France, along with Italy and some other European countries, protested at this obvious violation of international law. You're not supposed to shoot at United Nations peacekeepers. So Macron again spoke out about that. But then the other day, it was reported that he went a little bit further than that, and he addressed I think, the 800-pound gorilla in the room, which is that United Nations created Israel, so Israel really has no business attacking the United Nations. Keep in mind that Israel has actually banned the United Nations Secretary General Guterres from visiting the country. So Israel seems to be at war with the United Nations, the very body that had created it. This is something, incidentally, we've repeated many, many times on the Gaggle. Israel is unique in that it was entirely a creation of the United Nations. And it is extraordinary to listen to Israel's supporters when they rail at the United Nations and not really, acknowledge that but for the United Nations, there would be no state of Israel, and that Israel had made all sorts of pledges to the United Nations at the time that the United Nations invited Israel to become a member. Israel made a number of pledges that Israel hasn't remotely fulfilled. So let me just go through a few of the stories about this growing fight between Macron and Netanyahu. Again, here at the Gaggle, one really should always keep in mind that we don't take Macron terribly seriously. I mean, he says one thing one day, then he says the opposite the next day, and then he said a third thing on the third day. So it's very hard really to keep track of or make sense of any of Macron's pronouncements. But here is a story from the New York Times. This is a few days ago. It says, behind the war of words between Macron and Netanyahu, the French leader said countries should stop supplying weapons to Israel, arguing that providing arms while demanding a ceasefire is inconsistent. Wow, it's inconsistent. Imagine that. Providing arms while demanding a ceasefire is inconsistent. I mean, he's obviously rebuking the United States that goes through this deeply, deeply dishonest exercise of repeatedly expostulating for a ceasefire, for a deal. Got to get a deal done, as Kamala Harris says. We've got to get it done. We've got to get the hostages out. We've got to get a deal done, while continuing to pour arms into Israel. So, and it says, that drew the Israeli leaders' fury. Well, of course it did. But nothing much, as always, comes of it. So here we have the story when President Emmanuel Macron of France said over the weekend that countries should stop supplying Israel with weapons if they want to cease fire. The reaction from Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu was swift and scathing. Of course it was. And here's Netanyahu As Israel fights the forces of barbarism led by Iran, all civilized countries should be standing firmly by Israel's side. This is typical Israeli twaddle. And then yet President Macron and some other Western leaders are now calling for an arms embargo against Israel. Shame on them. Let me tell you this, he added, Israel will win with or without their support, but their shame will continue long after the war is won. Now, it's easy for him to say because, as I said, France really doesn't deliver too many weapons to Israel. Macron was largely having a go at the United States for its absolute dishonesty in continuing to supply arms to Israel while calling for a ceasefire, whatever they mean by that, a deal, and no doubt a two-state solution. But they're never going to do anything to make it realizable. And here we have, again, the Times goes on, Mr. Macron's comments were widely seen as a sign of frustration with the United States. Well, for good reason. And it says, if we call for a ceasefire, the consistent thing to do is not to supply the weapons of war, he said at a news conference on Saturday, adding that those who provide such weapons cannot stand by our side each day and call for a ceasefire while continuing to supply them. Well, yes, they can, and they will, and they continue to do this. They will stand side by side with France and call for a ceasefire, and then continue to supply the weapons. And then when Netanyahu does what he always does, launches some more attacks, whether in Gaza, whether in Lebanon, whether against Iran, then basically we have nothing further to do other than to say, well, let's negotiate some more about this ceasefire. We need this ceasefire. Remember, in Lebanon, France and the United States called for this 21-day ceasefire in Lebanon while Netanyahu was in New York addressing the UN General Assembly. And even as he was there, even as he was meeting the leaders of France and the United States, even as they were all calling for a ceasefire, he was planning the assassination of Nasrallah in Lebanon. He was just there. He did it, just as he was talking to Macron and Biden. He promptly calls for the orders rather the assassination of Nasrallah. But France, the New York Times goes on, has little leverage over U.S. arms shipments. Well, that's that with regard to that one. And then here we have another story. We have France, Italy summon Israeli ambassadors after UN peacekeepers struck by Israeli forces. So France and Italy summon, not the United States, but France and Italy summon Israeli ambassadors after UN peacekeepers struck by Israel. I mean, they feel a little bad about that. I mean, to be honest, none of the peacekeepers were killed. Nonetheless, it's not good for peacekeepers to be shot at. French Ministry for Foreign Affairs says Israel's targeting of UNIFIL troops was, quote, deliberate, unquote. Well, of course it was. Did anyone doubt it? And then it goes on. France and Italy are demanding answers from Israeli envoys after United Nations peacekeepers in South Lebanon were wounded in separate incidents. The two countries, which supply large amounts of troops to the UN peacekeeping mission in South Lebanon known as UNIFIL, summoned Israel's ambassadors to their respective capitals in response to incidents in which 4 peacekeepers were injured, one of whom required hospitalization. No French or Italian troops were wounded. France's Ministry for Foreign Affairs condemned the deliberate attack on Friday, which it said constitutes a serious violation of international law. Well, yes. What else is new? And then The two soldiers who were hurt on Thursday were injured after an Israeli tank fired toward a UNIFIL observation tower. The duo who sustained injuries on Friday were wounded after two explosions occurred close to an observation tower, UNIFIL said in a statement. This is a serious development. This is UNIFIL issuing a statement, says this is a serious development, and UNIFIL reiterates that the safety and security of UN personnel and property must be guaranteed, and that the inviolability of UN premises must be respected at all times. Any deliberate attack on peacekeepers is a grave violation of international humanitarian law. The Israel Defense Forces responded on X to both incidents. On Thursday, it noted that Hezbollah operates near both civilian and UNIFIL positions and said it maintains routine communication with UNIFIL. Well, yeah, because UNIFIL is a peacekeeping mission, so it would be surprising if they didn't maintain communications in order to ensure that that they don't get in the middle of a conflict, and they notify UNIFIL about its movements and so on. That's kind of what you're supposed to do with peacekeeping missions. You notify them and tell them, you know, what you intend to do, how you intend to do it, when you expect any movements to be concluded. But he says it maintains routine communications with UNIFIL. Responding to the reports of the two wounded soldiers on Friday, the IDF said in a statement that the incident took place when its soldiers responded to a threat located about 50 meters from a UNIFIL post. The Israeli military said that it had instructed UNIFIL personnel to enter into protected spaces and remain there. Again, Israel or Hezbollah or anyone else cannot go around instructing UNIFIL to go somewhere where they're not basically observing what they're supposed to be observing. That's the whole point of a peacekeeping mission. They're supposed to observe the movements of the rival forces. And then, but demanding that an international force dedicated to preserving peace in a geopolitical hotspot move to facilitate a military invasion is highly inflammatory. It is. Irish President Michael Higgins called such a move outrageous, while Italian Defense Minister Guido Crosetto on Thursday said that the peacekeepers will stay where they are. We will never be the ones to move because someone tells us by force to move, Crosetto said. Now, this is where it gets quite interesting, where it says Macron warns Netanyahu he must not forget Israel was created by a UN decision. Well, before I get on to that, I want to show you something else. Let me go. Yeah, what's interesting that this attack on UN forces is, of course, something that Israel has done habitually in the past. I mean, we've talked before about the Stern Gang's assassination of Count Bernadotte, the UN official, because it just didn't like his activities, even though he had saved Jews during the Holocaust, and even though he was facilitating the partition agreement in Palestine, which Israel pretended to accept, but he didn't accept. But you know, Count Bernadotte was assassinated by the Stern Gang. That included such illustrious members as Yitzhak Shamir, who then became, some years later, Prime Minister of Israel. So that was in 1947. But Israel has made a number of attacks over the years on United Nations missions. And here we have the case in 1996, again in Lebanon, And it says here that UN soldiers' video reveals reconnaissance plane was over the Kana as shelling killed 100 refugees. So this was a UN base in Lebanon in 1996 that was shot at by Israel, and some 100 refugees that were being protected by the United Nations were killed. And here we have a dramatic amateur videotape of the Israeli shelling of the United Nations base at Kana last month, in which more than 100 Lebanese civilians were massacred, has convinced United Nations investigators that the Israelis deliberately targeted the UN compound and were well aware that it was packed with refugees when they fired at it. So let's read that again. This videotape of the Israeli shelling of a United Nations base in Kana in Lebanon, in which more than 100 Lebanese civilians were massacred, has convinced United Nations investigators that the Israelis deliberately targeted the UN compound and were well aware that it was packed with refugees when they fired at it. And then here's another attack. Israel blames map error for UN deaths in bombing. And it says the Israeli military yesterday blamed human error made during the duplication of maps for the bombing of a UN post in southern Lebanon in July. This is in 2006, so this is 10 years later, in which 4 unarmed international observers were killed during the conflict with Hezbollah. The UN post, a white building on the hilltop of Khiam, was wrongly identified as a Hezbollah position. So again, we're supposed to believe this kind of nonsense. Israel is supposed to have this super duper brilliant intelligence, and yeah, I got the map wrong. You know, they don't know how to read maps. You know, it's just like remember the we've talked about this many times before, the bombing of the Chinese embassy in Belgrade in 1999, and the Americans said, we're working with an old map. We work with a paper map. Clearly, it was out of date. One building was labeled something else. Sorry, these things happen. It says the UN post, the white building on a hilltop in Khiam, was wrongly identified as a Hezbollah position. And then this is said by the Israeli Foreign Ministry. In the report, Israel expressed deepest condolences and sincere regret. There was a mishap on the Israeli side where the duplication of maps, the UN position on the maps, was not marked as it should have been. And that created the tragedy. This is Mr. Regev, his Israeli Foreign Ministry spokesman said. 4 observers from China, Austria, Finland, and Canada were killed when an Israeli plane dropped the bomb, thought to be precision guided, on the building. So that was that. Now, let me just go back at... so here we have Macron warns Netanyahu he, quote, must not forget Israel was created by UN decision. So this is the one. Tensions between France and Israel have been on the rise as the situation deteriorates in Lebanon. And then it says, French President Emmanuel Macron warned Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu not to ignore United Nations decisions during a weekly meeting with his ministers, according to French media reports confirmed by a participant in the meeting. So he didn't say, Macron didn't say this publicly. He allegedly said this in his meeting with his ministers. And obviously it was leaked to the media. Mr. Netanyahu must not forget that his country was created by a UN decision. He's quoted as saying, referencing the UN General Assembly's November 1947 vote that terminated the British mandate of Palestine and split the land into a Jewish and Arab state. And I mean, that's kind of one thing, but there's obviously other decisions because there was a decision to invite Israel to become a member of the United Nations. That was in 1948, and that they didn't have to do that, but they did, even though Israel's borders were not settled, and that's right away was very problematic if you become a member state of the United Nations, though your final borders have not been settled. And also because the borders of 1948 after the war were not, no one regarded them as Israel's final borders. Nonetheless, the United Nations invited Israel to join with the provisos that Israel solves the Palestinian refugee question and the proviso that Jerusalem remains an international city. It has not become the possession of Israel. It remains an international city because it is the home of three of the world's great religions. So that was the key ingredient of Israel's sort of membership of the United Nations. And then it goes on. The French president recently called for a halt to arms deliveries to Israel. And then Macron's call not to ignore UN decisions refers to the situation in southern Lebanon and Israeli fire against UN peacekeepers. Paris has summoned the Israeli ambassador to France in wake of an incident in which the two UN staff were wounded. On Monday, France's Armed Forces Minister, Sébastien Lecornu, echoed these warnings from France, telling a journalist that it was a problem that Israel does not respect UN resolution. Yeah. I mean, how many resolutions? I mean, do we really want to start on that? How many UN resolutions has Israel rejected, including, of course, the we talked about the one in 47, 48, but of course there was the resolution 242 after the 1967 war, in which Israel was supposed to return all the occupied lands. That was 1967. So that was now, more than 57 years ago. Israel has not fulfilled that crucial UN resolution. And again, the French minister says it was a UN resolution that created Israel, one of the first. And then here we have another story. Netanyahu blasts back at Macron in argument over the creation of Israel. Tensions rise between the two leaders over Israeli strikes in Lebanon. It says here, on Tuesday, Netanyahu clapped back at France, saying that Israel was created not by a UN ruling, but by the 1948 War of Independence. A reminder to the president of France, it was not the UN resolution that established the state of Israel, but rather a victory achieved in the War of Independence with the blood of heroic fighters, many of whom were Holocaust survivors, including from the Vichy regime in France. So he brings in Vichy to attack Macron. Really completely reprehensible, because all Macron had said correctly that Israel was a creation of the United Nations. So Netanyahu and Israel, as his and it is its want, now escalated by somehow linking Macron to Vichy. And clearly saying something that is just false. It's not because it is established by force of arms, because, again, Israel could have been liquidated at any time at all, but it hasn't been. And what was required of Israel was that it adhere to United Nations resolutions. something Israel has repeatedly refused to do. And then it says here, this is from Le Monde, Macron-Netanyahu tensions escalate after French president's comments on the creation of Israel. And President Emmanuel Macron has been quoted as saying that Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu should not forget that his country was created by a UN decision. And Netanyahu must not forget that his country was created by a UN decision, Macron said at a cabinet meeting, according to comments reported by the media's participant, as the war in Gaza and the fighting underway in Lebanon were being discussed. This comment was a reference to Resolution 181, adopted in November 1947 by the UN General Assembly, providing for the partition of Palestine into a Jewish state and an Arab state. And therefore, this is not the time to break away from UN decisions. And again, it's all very well for these French leaders to talk about this Resolution 181. Where is the Palestinian state? I mean, yeah, there was a partition plan, and Palestine was supposed to be partitioned between an Israeli state and a Palestinian state, but there's no Palestinian state. So that was now almost 80 years ago, and there's no Palestinian state. So it's really a little bit rich for France to suddenly talk about these UN resolutions when none of them have been fulfilled. So again, it's this utterly disingenuous talk. Well, the United Nations, United Resolution, very important. We must maintain the United Nations when you haven't done anything to fulfill any of these United Nations resolutions. You basically look the other way when Israel has ignored all of them. And then suddenly you feel very good about yourself and feel very self-righteous in talking about the glories of the United Nations when you haven't done anything to ensure that these resolutions are fulfilled. And then said, this is not the time to break away from UN decisions, and in an allusion to strikes that targeted the UN mission deployed in southern Lebanon. And as I said, this is nothing new about this. Israel has regularly attacked UN compounds, UN bases, and UN personnel. This is an ongoing thing. And then the strikes to target the UN, an organization which Israel has demanded be redeployed a little further north so it can carry out an offensive against Hezbollah. So again, Israel is demanding that UNIFIL, over which it has no jurisdiction. I mean, the UNIFIL works for the United Nations. It demands that UNIFIL redeploy where Israel wants it to redeploy so that Israel can do whatever it wants to do in Lebanon. So get out of the way. Go. Even though the deployment of UNIFIL has nothing to do with Israel, it was a decision of the UN Security Council going all the way back to 1978. And then Netanyahu's response was scathing. And then again, he says it was not a UN decision that established the state of Israel, but the victory that was achieved in the War of Independence. And then again with the thing about Vichy. Netanyahu also received support from the president of the Representative Council of French Jewish Institutions. And he says, the remarks attributed to the President of the Republic, if confirmed, are both a historical and a political error. This is wrote Jonathan Arfi in a post on X, to suggest that the creation of the State of Israel was the result of a political decision by the UN is to ignore the century-long history of Zionism. I mean, this is a complete non sequitur. It was created by a decision of the United Nations. Who cares about the century-long history of Zionism, which of course involved the appropriation of land that did not belong to the Zionist settlers. And then here again, yet another story. Netanyahu and Macron trade barbs. And this is from Times of Israel. And then it goes on, which says here, which the other stories didn't highlight, the two men also spoke by phone, with Macron continuing to push for a 21-day ceasefire in Lebanon to get to a diplomatic settlement, which he called, quote, the only one likely to meet Israel's security requirements. No, I mean, Israel has never accepted any diplomatic settlements unless they just simply recognize Israeli power, and he's never accepted any UN resolutions. And Israel has simply arrogated to itself to decide entirely for itself what meets or doesn't meet its security requirements. In the Israeli readout, Netanyahu rejected calls for a ceasefire. Of course it did. And said he would only agree to an arrangement in which all Hezbollah forces are pushed out of a buffer zone on Israel's border. And then he goes on the phone Tuesday, Macron expressed his indignation after several peacekeepers were wounded by Israel forces and urged Israel to put an end to this unjustifiable targeting. Netanyahu again called for the peacekeepers in southern Lebanon to move from certain areas near the Israeli borders, while dismissing as completely false claims that Israeli forces deliberately targeted UNIFIL. I mean, there's no, it's even from these statements, it's clear that Israel is targeting UNIFIL. I mean, we've had plenty of statements that, they're coordinating with Hezbollah, they're communicating with Hezbollah. And anyway, they shouldn't be here. They should be somewhere else where we tell them to go. And now they're going to say something preposterous. Oh, well, we didn't target them deliberately. No, we didn't target. I mean, it just happenstance that, that Israel started shooting at them. And then that's it. So is this a storm in a teacup? Unfortunately, it probably is. What I think is interesting is that Macron has blurted out something that is rarely stated, something that's very important to state. I mean, so, only people in the alt media state, which is Israel owes its existence to the United Nations. And there's a limit to how much, in theory, the nations of the world can accept somebody expressing such contempt for the organization of the United Nations. I mean, it's bad enough anybody to express such open contempt for the United Nations, but it's particularly irksome when the state that does so much, and far more than any other state, to express this contempt for the United Nations, it's particularly irksome when that state itself was created by the United Nations, and that state was ordered as a condition of its membership to fulfill a number of United Nations resolutions, and that state has not even remotely fulfilled those conditions. And so the French have said this, and so now it's on the record. So yes, I'm sure Macron and Netanyahu will at some point, have yet another phone conversation, and they'll iron out their differences, and France will declare, we have been Israel's best friend over the years. We love Israel. It's our close ally. Sometimes we have to talk bluntly with close allies. I'm sure it'll be papered over like that. Nonetheless, it's instructive that Macron and his ministers have pointed out something that needs pointing out. Israel is a creation of the United Nations. No other state is so openly and explicitly a creature of the United Nations. So Israel has no business shooting at the United Nations officials, and has no business declaring UN Secretary General Gutierrez a persona non grata. Anyway, thank you very much for joining me. If you like the gaggle, please like, share, and subscribe. See you soon. Bye-bye.